My brother Connor crashed a brand new car at 4:47 on a Sunday morning. My father, Gary, screamed at me for 20 minutes straight. He called me selfish. He called me vindictive. He said I'd ruined the family with my attitude problem. I stood in my apartment, phone pressed to my ear, listening to his world shatter while I remained perfectly calm. He didn't ask if I was breathing. He just wanted a scapegoat for his golden boy's latest disaster. But Gary didn't know the truth yet. This wasn't a tragedy. It was an audit. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. Gary was still shouting when I set my phone on the kitchen counter and switched it to speaker. His voice was a distorted rasp, filled with the kind of entitlement that only comes from decades of getting your own way. He was in Monterey, likely pacing the length of his Italian marble foyer, while I was in my apartment, watching the gray fog roll in over the coast. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why he was blaming me for a car I wasn't even driving. In our family, explanations are just weaknesses for Gary to exploit. Instead, I opened my laptop. The screen glowed with a clinical, white light. This wasn't an emotional breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for way too long. My compassion was a luxury resource they'd overdrafted for years. But today, the bank was closed. Gary never understood the cloud. To him, the internet was just a place to check golf scores. 3 years ago, when he asked me to digitize the family office records to save on overhead, I built the entire architecture myself. He thought he was being a savvy businessman by delegating tech chores to his daughter. He didn't realize that by letting me set up the master encrypted keys, he'd effectively handed me the remote control to his entire world. I wasn't just a marketing executive, I was the ghost architect of his fortress. I logged in to our real estate empire's shared company portal. My fingers moved with the precision of a surgeon. First, I went to the marketing accounts. Connor, the brother who just wrapped a luxury vehicle around a guardrail, had been treating our promotional budget like his personal piggy bank for months. Gary allowed it because Connor was still, supposedly, learning the ropes. In reality, Connor was learning how to buy premium lifestyle upgrades on my dime. I clicked his name. Revoke access. Confirm. Just like that, the digital keys to the kingdom were gone. He wouldn't be ordering any more client dinners that were actually just bar tabs with his deadbeat friends. Next, I opened my personal banking app. Every month, for 2 years, a recurring transfer of $4,500 left my account. It was a business consultant fee, or so Gary told the tax man. In reality, it was me footing the bill for Connor's credit card debts and his gambling losses at the local casinos. Gary had framed it as my contribution to the family legacy. I stared at the active status of that transfer. For 2 years, I had worked 60-hour weeks as a senior marketing executive just to keep Connor from facing a collection agency. I had been the human glue holding their fragile status together. I hit cancel. The confirmation window popped up. Recurring transfer canceled successfully. It took less than 5 minutes. Gary was still mid-sentence, lecturing me about how I needed to be a team player and forgive Connor's little mistake. Are you listening to me, Olivia? Gary barked through the phone. You need to get down to the impound lot and handle the paperwork. Your brother is in no state to deal with the police. I picked up the phone. My voice was cold, clinical, and entirely devoid of the daughter he thought he owned. No, Gary, I said. I'm not handling anything. I've just revoked Connor's access to the company funds. And that $4,500 payment I send him every month, it's gone. Effective immediately. The silence on the other end was absolute. It was the sound of a tycoon realizing his most reliable asset just walked off the job. "You can't do that," he finally whispered. "I already did," I replied. I ended the call and went to make some coffee. I had a long day of accounting ahead of me. I watched the steam rise from my coffee mug, my mind drifting back to the 7 years I'd spent as the ghost in the machine of Gary's real estate empire. In Monterey, status is the only currency that doesn't depreciate, and in our family, that currency was minted with my labor and spent on Connor's whims. While Connor was busy failing his way through a 2-year degree that Gary eventually just bought for him, I was pulling 60-hour weeks. I started as a junior analyst, skipping lunches and staying late until the cleaning crews became my only social circle. Last quarter, I landed a $28,000 raise through sheer, undeniable merit. I didn't tell Gary, I knew better. In our house, my achievements weren't celebrated. They were simply appraised for how much of Connor's mess they could clean up. This is what I've come to realize is the trap of normalizing cruelty. In high-status families like mine, the toxicity isn't a glitch, it's a feature. They didn't ignore my hard work because they were busy. They ignored it to keep me hungry for a scrap of validation that would never come. It's a calculated method to keep the useful child producing while the favorite child consumes. 2 weeks ago, I finally took $18,000 of my own hard-earned savings money I'd tucked away while driving a car that leaked when it drizzled and put it down on a Porsche Taycan. It was lunar silver, sleek, and entirely mine. When I showed it to Gary, he didn't ask about the performance or the electric range. He just looked at it and asked why I didn't buy something more traditional to match the company fleet. This from a man who handed Connor the keys to a top-tier Jeep Wrangler on his 24th birthday, paid in full with no strings attached. When I turned 24, Gary gave me a roadside assistance membership and told me it was practical for my aging sedan. The math of his love was always easy to solve. A luxury off-roader for the son who couldn't keep a job, and a phone number for a tow truck for the daughter who was running his marketing department. I've spent a lifetime wondering what I did to deserve being the spare at the table, but sitting in the silence of my apartment, I finally understood. I wasn't being punished for my failures. I was being exploited for my competence. They had turned our relationship into a subscription service where I paid the premium and they enjoyed the perks. But I was done being the silent investor in their fraudulent version of family. This wasn't a daughter reaching her breaking point. This was a senior marketing executive performing a hostile takeover of her own life. The notifications started hitting my phone before I even finished my first cup of coffee. My mother, Stephanie, didn't call to ask why I was awake at 5 in the morning or if I was okay after Gary's verbal explosion. Instead, she sent a barrage of texts that read like a ransom note for my conscience. She told me I was a monster for cutting off Connor while he was lying in a hospital bed. She said that my father was on the verge of a breakdown and that I had humiliated the family by choosing a bank balance over my own blood. When the text didn't work, she moved to her favorite theater, social media. Stephanie is a master of the cryptic high society smear. She posted a photo on the Monterey Elite Circle Facebook group, a sunset over the bay, with a caption about how some children let the poison of money rot their souls. She didn't name me, but in a town like this, she didn't have to. The local social climbers were already liking and commenting, offering their prayers for the burden she was carrying. It was a classic escalation. In their minds, I was still the variable they could manipulate with guilt. They weren't shocked by what Connor had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. Then came the message from Connor. He was texting from his hospital bed, his entitlement apparently unaffected by the sedative. He didn't apologize for wrecking a luxury vehicle or for being a high-rate intoxicated driver. He simply demanded that I transfer $15,000 for his bail immediately. He claimed he was only on the road that early to pick up a high-profile investor as a surprise for Gary's business. He told me that if I didn't pay, I was personally responsible for ruining the biggest deal the company had seen in years. I stared at his words. The audacity was almost impressive. He was facing a felony charge, and his first instinct was to lie about his motives and demand more of my resources. He really believed that the $4,500 I had been paying his debt collectors every month was a basic human right, not a sacrifice I had been forced to make. Watching them double down on their cruelty gave me something better than an apology. It gave me a moral green light. For years, I had worried that setting boundaries made me the difficult one, the selfish one. But as I read those messages, I didn't feel a single spark of guilt. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. They were never going to change because they didn't think they had to. As long as I was there to catch the glass before it hit the floor, they would keep throwing it. But I wasn't the safety net anymore. I was the floor. I didn't answer a single text. I didn't comment on the post. I simply went back to my laptop. The personal war was over. The professional strike was just beginning. I stopped reacting to the vibration of my phone. Every text from my mother or Connor was just noise, unprocessed data that had no place in the professional audit I was about to conduct. I didn't need to yell back. I didn't need to scream. I needed to document. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I called an old contact from my early days in banking, a woman who specialized in forensic accounting. People think forensic accounting is a sprint. It's actually a marathon. I hadn't spent the last 6 months just working late for the marketing team. I had been feeding encrypted snippets of Gary's shadow ledgers to her for half a year. We were just missing one final piece, the physical proof of where the offshore cash was hidden. When the call came about the crash, I knew the secret compartment in Gary's Taycan was now in a police impound lot. I sent one text. The asset is compromised. Finalize the report. By 8:30 a.m., the file that had been 6 months in the making finally landed in my inbox, ready to be a guillotine. She was the kind of person who could find a missing cent in a graveyard of bad debt. I told her I suspected internal irregularities in our real estate firm's marketing budget, specifically the accounts I managed. I wasn't looking for an apology anymore. I was looking for a paper trail. For years, Gary had insisted on having the final sign-off for all promotional spending. I'd always interpreted it as his typical need for absolute control. But as we started digging through the digital archives that Sunday morning, a much darker pattern emerged. My father hadn't just been a demanding boss. He'd been using my department as a laundry service. We found thousands of dollars categorized as community outreach events that were actually direct wire transfers to cover Connor's high-stakes losses at the local casinos. There were digital consulting fees paid to shell companies that led straight back to Gary's personal accounts. He was siphoning wealth out of the company to maintain the family's elite Monterey status, all while making me look like the reason our marketing returns were lower than projected. He had been systematically stealing my earned commissions and my professional reputation to fund his favorite son's addiction to failure. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, but the bank was finally closed. Olivia, this isn't just a family disagreement, my contact said, her voice grave over the line. This is systematic corporate fraud. If the board of directors sees these mismatched invoices and forged signatures, Gary isn't just losing his position. He's looking at a permanent exit from the industry. I felt a cold wave of realization. My father had placed me in the middle of a legal minefield to protect Connor. My name was on those budget reports. If I didn't act immediately, I'd be categorized as an accomplice. Gary had gambled with my freedom to keep his golden boy's shoes clean. I spent the next several hours compiling a lethal dossier. I didn't feel a single drop of sadness or a moment of hesitation. This wasn't an emotional breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I organized the facts with clinical precision. The stolen funds, the unrecorded assets, and the clear evidence that Gary had been using the family legacy as a personal bank account. By the time the fog began to lift from the bay, my laptop glowed with a different kind of power. I wasn't just the invisible daughter anymore. I was the auditor. Inside my apartment, the screen showed a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. The police report hit my inbox like a silent bullet at exactly 8:30 a.m. Gary and Stephanie were so consumed by the theater of their own outrage that they hadn't actually looked at the impound documents. They were so sure that I was the one who had allowed this to happen that they missed the most important detail in the entire file. They assumed the silver Porsche Taycan twisted around that guardrail on the Pacific Coast Highway was mine. After all, in their minds, I was the only one with something to lose. But here's the thing about being the family's ghost. I am the only one who truly knows where everything is hidden. I didn't mention to Gary that I had driven my car 3 blocks away to Colleen's building at 9 o'clock on Saturday night. I didn't tell him that my first major luxury purchase was sitting under a concrete roof, safe from the storm and far away from Connor's grasping hands. What Connor snatched from the kitchen counter wasn't my key. It was the master key to Gary's most dangerous secret. My father had bought a second Porsche Taycan months ago, identical to mine in every way, right down to the lunar silver paint. But that car wasn't a business asset. It was a shell. Gary was right in the middle of a relentless IRS audit. He was desperate to hide $145,000 in unrecorded offshore business funds that he'd skimmed from our real estate developments over the last 3 years. He thought the safest place for that money was inside a generic luxury vehicle that everyone assumed belonged to his hard-working daughter. He used my reputation as a shield for his crimes. He had hollowed out the interior panels of that car and turned it into a high-speed safe. He thought he was being brilliant. He thought he could park his tax evasion right under the government's nose. But the universe has a very sharp sense of irony. By crashing that specific car and bringing the state police to the scene, Connor did more than just total a vehicle. He essentially invited the federal government to perform a roadside search of Gary's hidden vault. The state troopers didn't just find a drunk driver. They found the hidden compartments. They found the unrecorded cash and the ledgers that Gary thought he'd scrubbed from the company servers. Connor didn't just fail a sobriety test. He effectively handed the keys to my father's cell to the district attorney. The man who had spent 20 minutes screaming that I was destroying the family was currently the primary target of a federal investigation for tax evasion and forgery. And his favorite son was the one who had signed the confession in bent metal and broken glass. I sat back and looked at the digital report on my screen. This wasn't a tragedy. It was the most satisfying math problem I had ever solved. The family piece that my mother always begged for had been a fraud, and the cost of the subscription had just gone up. Way up. The man who once made other men feel small just by standing near his car now looked like a ghost haunting his own lobby. Gary appeared at my office door at 10 in the morning, his face pale and his eyes bloodshot from a night of realizing that his favorite son had just handed the federal government a map to his crimes. The tycoon who had once filled every room with his ego now looked like he was barely holding on to his own skin. He didn't come with a lecture or a demand this time. He came with a plea. "Olivia, please," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "The feds are all over the company's servers. They're asking about the marketing budgets from 2021. If they see those ledgers, it's over for all of us." I sat behind my mahogany desk and watched him. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel the familiar urge to fix his mess. I felt the kind of clinical detachment you feel when you're watching a bad investment finally hit zero. I realized then that Gary's power was only ever an illusion, a status symbol he had rented with other people's labor and stolen tax money. This is the power illusion of an empty wallet. When the wealth evaporates and the status is stripped away, men like Gary are revealed to have no internal foundation. He wasn't a leader. He was a shell that money had inflated. Without the money, there was no character left to stand on. "You need to misplace those records, Olivia," he urged, leaning over my desk. "Just for a few days, long enough for the lawyers to find a loophole. Use that $28,000 raise of yours to put a retainer down on a high-end defense attorney for me and Connor. We're family. We have to protect the legacy." I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized he still thought I was a resource he could harvest. He wanted me to commit a federal crime and spend my own hard-earned money to save the man who had called me a worthless burden just hours before. "I'm not misplacing anything, Gary," I said, my voice steady and cold. "And I'm certainly not sending a cent of my merit-based raise on a defense for a legacy built on fraud." "You're being vindictive," he hissed, the old Gary trying to claw his way back to the surface. "After everything I've done for you, what did you do, Gary? You gave me a tow truck membership and a mountain of someone else's debt," I replied. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder. It wasn't an apology. It was a formal termination of my employment and a full disclosure of the internal audit I had completed that morning. "Family doesn't keep score, Gary." "You told me that yourself," I said as I slid the folder across the desk. "But the IRS certainly does. And they just hit the jackpot." I stood up and walked toward the door. I didn't look back to see him crumble. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a liquidation. And for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the gavel. It has been 4 months since the gavel fell and the liquidation of the Gilmore legacy began. Gary is currently under house arrest, confined to the very marble foyer he once paced while screaming at me. The Monterey social circles that Stephanie spent 30 years courting have vanished like the morning mist. She lives in a modest rental now, a place where no one cares about the roses or the labels on the wine. Connor is serving 18 months for the high-rate DUI and the unauthorized use of that mobile safe. For the first time in 26 years, no one is there to catch him, and he is finally learning the weight of a world that doesn't recognize his golden boy status. I am sitting on my new balcony, watching the sunset dip into the Pacific. I got the promotion to branch manager, and my name is finally on the door. My Porsche Taycan sits in a secure, covered parking spot every single night, untouched and entirely mine. Some habits you don't break. I don't feel the hollow ache of despair anymore. I feel the weight of my own worth. To those of you listening who feel like you're standing on the edge, invisible in your own home, this is a letter to you. You've spent your life being told that your boundaries are selfish, that your rigidity is a problem, and that you owe your peace to people who only value you when they need something. But the truth is, your boundaries aren't an act of war. They are your survival kit. Stop being the safety net for people who refuse to look where they're walking. When you finally step back and let the consequences happen naturally, you aren't being cruel, you're being an architect of reality. Love without boundaries isn't love, it's just a longer fall. You deserve a life built on your own merit, on your own road, in a car that no one else has the right to wreck. Your silence isn't a weakness, and your no is the most powerful thing you own. Use it. If you've ever had to choose yourself over a toxic situation, share your story below. You never know who your courage might inspire today. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of justice.